All right, my friends, welcome back to Anti-War Radio on Chaos Radio 95.9 in Austin, Texas. I'm Scott Horton, and our first guest today is Eric Boehlert from Media Matters for America. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, yeah, well, I saw this great piece that I got in my email box this morning about news coverage of the war, and I admit I'm spoiled rotten. I read antiwar.com every day. I got all the news from every newspaper in the world that matters about anything, and I forget sometimes what it's like to be the average American who relies on TV to tell them what's going on in the world, 10 minutes here and 10 minutes there and so forth. And you guys do a really good job at Media Matters, and I don't always agree, but I do always appreciate your work, and you really go through and break down all the statistics for us. And in your article today, you've got links to 4 or 5 different polls and 4 or 5 different studies by different universities and so forth, backing up, counting the coverage for you and comparing that to people's attitudes and so forth. And it's a great piece of work, and it's a great example of the kind of work that you guys do at Media Matters, I think.
Thanks, I appreciate it. And you mentioned the 10 minutes. That's probably being generous to the bits and pieces of television news coverage we've seen from Iraq. I mean, the headline of the piece is the Iraq news blackout, how the press spent its summer vacation. Mm-hmm. And it's really amazing. And what I stumbled across were 2 separate surveys that are done in conjunction with each other. One is from the Project for Excellence in Journalism, and the other is the Pew Research. And every week, Pew Research polls 1,000 adults and asks them what is the news story they followed most closely the previous week. And Project for Excellence in Journalism monitors on a weekly basis, has this ongoing study, 48 major media outlets, radio, TV, network, cable, newspapers, and it documents exactly how much space editors and producers give each story. So it's a great way to tell what Americans are paying attention to and what the media is paying attention to.
Uh-huh. I'm reminded of a Henry Kissinger quote, actually, where he said he watches the news every night, but with the volume off. He doesn't care what they're saying, but what matters is how much time they spend on each subject and which order they run.
Yeah, and television really is king in terms of, communicating with Americans. But if you look at the studies, the disconnect between the amount of attention Americans are paying to the situation in Iraq, meaning reporting on the ground from Iraq, and the amount of coverage the press is giving it is sort of mind-boggling. And in the column I go through every week of the summer, and on average during the summer, the situation in Iraq, that was one of the news categories, was far and away the most popular, the most closely watched news event of the summer, week after week after week. And on average for the summer, 31% of Americans said they followed the situation from Iraq very closely. The amount of news coverage it got week after week, the situation in Iraq represented 4.5% of all the news coverage. And if it wasn't for the more aggressive coverage in newspapers online, that number would have been even lower, because cable and network news, essentially boycotted Iraq during the summer. And here we are with Americans week after week saying it's the most important story. It's this, not really the most important, because that's a slightly different answer. It's the story they're following the most closely.
Right.
And the press couldn't care less at this point. And I write about how Iraq fatigue, the difference is how it affects Americans and how it affects newsrooms. It hasn't affected most Americans. They're almost just as interested today as they were 4 years ago.
Well, is it just
But in newsrooms, they have just walked away from the whole thing.
Why have they just walked away? I mean, you mentioned the costs of security. I mean, obviously they can't. It's hard to leave the green zone. Patrick Coburn's got the courage to go riding around in the back of a taxi, but not too many of these guys do, and I can understand that. I don't want to go, trolling around Iraq in a car and get my head cut off either. But at the same time, I mean, hell, they could at least stand on the porch in the green zone and look out and tell us something, right?
That's right. We don't even see the and I'm the last one, to question the courage of any of the reporters. The fact that they're there is, I think, is testament to their professionalism and wanting to be at the center of the action. But you're right, we don't even see sort of the rooftop reports from the green zone anymore. It's been difficult and expensive and deadly to cover Iraq for years now, but that really doesn't explain the precipitous drop we've seen this summer. And the irony is, I let off the column, I noted, Katie Couric is in Iraq and reporting from Baghdad, and she said she went over there because she wanted to get more context. She wanted to get, a better sense of what was going on. And my point is, well, if CBS had simply reported the story all summer, she wouldn't have had to travel 8,000 miles to figure out what was going on in Iraq.
Yeah, that's just the fact that Katie Couric is a news person. I don't know. I haven't watched the nightly news on the broadcast channels, ABC, CBS, NBC. I haven't watched those newscasts in so long. I'm disconnected. But the idea that Americans are turning to Katie Couric to do the hard news at night, wasn't that Dan Rather's? Is she's in Dan Rather's chair or Brokaw's or one of those?
Dan Rather, right? Yeah.
Oh man. Well, okay.
That is what
I don't
it
want to
is.
go too far down that rabbit trail.
Right.
That could lead to all kinds of nightmares. But yeah, see, here's the thing though, Eric. I'm a real free market kind of guy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a plumb line libertarian.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me like the free market is demanding Iraq coverage. Why aren't we getting it?
Well, it's interesting, and as I point out in my piece, I said, journalism is a public service, but it's also a business. So, editors and producers are always trying to match up what they cover with what people are interested in. I mean, you'd be a fool to devote all your time and resources consistently to stories that research shows news consumers have no interest in. I mean, there has to be a cross-section. But here we're seeing the exact opposite. I mean, we're seeing news consumers telling pollsters week after week after week the most important news story in Iraq, and we have the mainstream press just walking away from it. So the question is, you're right, why is that happening? Well, as I mentioned, there's a lot more news from Iraq online and in newspapers, and I think if you focus on online, I think it's just another example of why more and more people are getting their news online. It seems to be, in this specific case, it seems to be a better reflection in terms of what people want and what they're getting, and they're finding it online. For whatever reason, the news people in charge of the sites that are being monitored online are doing a better job there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and maybe the TV people realize, well, the people who actually want real news are now reading it, and so we're only left with the audience that wants to hear about the gay Republican senator or whatever.
Well, that might be, but again, I mean, this story is Iraq has been such an important story for so long. It's sort of amazing that particularly television producers came to this decision this summer that they're just not going to cover it. I mean, for a quarter in the second quarter, MSNBC, for instance, devoted 1.5% of its entire news coverage to events in Iraq. And the amazing thing is, there's all this hype about the Petraeus report coming up.
Right.
And there's obviously going to be a heated debate in Washington about, troop levels and America's continued presence in Iraq. And how are Americans supposed to make informed decisions, about our future in Iraq if we can't even get news coverage?
Right.
And again, if you look at these polls, they're begging for more news coverage from Iraq,
right?
And they're just not getting it from the mainstream press. And as you mentioned, I think it's another reason that people are sort of slowly but steadily walking away from the mainstream press as their number one news source.
Mm-hmm. And the amount of coverage that there actually is mostly a bunch of ridiculous hype anyway. I mean, I've been hearing for 2 or 3 months that the liberal media just won't report it, but the surge is going well. And
right.
yet that's all I hear from anybody.
Right. And we're only going to see more of that as the hype of the report comes up.
Yeah.
That certainly is the conservative talking point.
Yeah.
That the press won't. The press
even
won't
the
report.
liberal one. I mean, this is what I see on basically every news source. And it's funny. I'm sorry. I just want to pick on MSNBC here since you mentioned them. I'm sure that you're aware. you'll remember exactly what I'm talking about. There's this clip that they play as their stock news footage of the Iraq War on MSNBC that they've been playing for years now. And as far as I can tell, I believe it's from the original invasion. And it's a picture of a tank round. It's actually a few different clips, but the one that's the most memorable is, I guess, a tank round or something hitting this kind of pale red building. And the whole building is just kind of destroyed and collapses in and so forth. And it's a very old-looking structure. And they don't even have new pictures of things exploding to show us at all. Like, they don't even have a cameraman on the ground. I'm going to sit here and, as Chris Matthews or whoever it is spending his, 1 minute per show on Iraq.
Right.
And I'm going to sit here and I'm going to watch this same building get shot by this same tank round that I've been watching for years.
For 4.5 years. Well, they just don't, they literally can't even cover most of the country. And I referenced that. If folks remember, on August 14th, there were the 5 synchronized suicide bombers in northern Iraq up by the Syrian border that killed over 500 people.
Mm-hmm. The attack on the Yazidis.
Yeah, exactly. And they just, obviously they could only send stringers up there because no American journalist could survive a trip up to the border and back. And it was the 500 people, more than 500 people were killed. It was the second deadliest terror strike ever. Only behind 9/11 were more civilians killed in a terrorist attack.
Wow.
And the next night, it wasn't even the lead story on NBC Nightly News. It was on page 6, the New York Times, page 6 of the Washington Post. And, if that, if a sort of a historic, monstrous act of destruction like that, won't wake the press from its slumber, I'm not sure what will.
Yeah, but see, okay, here we got to get back to this thing about the boredom and the slumber and all that. And pardon me for being, I really don't mean to lean conspiracy kook here, but I kind of imagine, somebody in the White House or the National Security Council or something making some phone calls to some newspaper editors and some TV producers and telling them, hey, look, we're working on this whole surge is working great thing, and you're not going to screw it up for us, you understand? Or maybe not, maybe more subtle than that. Just, hey, this is what the White House wants. This is what the White House gets. It can't just be that all these reporters are this bored with the story. I have to tell you, I'm sick and tired of it myself, but that's not the same as bored. And I still cover it every single day.
Right.
So, I don't know. I guess the easy answer is, hey, these reporters, they're all just individuals and they can only do what they can do and they're just not interested. But, the way you lay it out in this article, where, the casualty rates are going up this much, the interest in the news stories goes up this much, while the coverage is a perfect sine wave going the other direction.
Yeah, right.
Is it possible that there's something behind this?
Well, the only thing that I could think that the correlation would be is that the press, there certainly are the talking points coming out of the White House that the surge is working, and Republicans are making that case. My only thought was that the press doesn't want to be caught, on the wrong side of the story. They don't want to, much like they didn't want to be caught on the wrong side during the run-up to the war.
Mm-hmm.
And, they don't want to wake up one day and suddenly, obviously it's not going to happen. It doesn't happen overnight. All of a sudden, the surge has been victorious and we've won the war. They don't want to be out there being portrayed or seen as being negative because that liberal media bias charge still carries a lot of weight. I don't know if that's why it's happening, but, there is a political element here, and the political element is, the surge is working and the press isn't reporting all the good news. We've heard that mantra literally since March 2003.
Absolutely, all the way through. The funny thing is, though, I guess that kind of leads to a separate question, which is the ignorance of these reporters. I'm here to tell you that anybody who says the surge is working is on the wrong side of the story. The fact that they recruited the Sunni insurgency to fight al-Qaeda when they had already turned on al-Qaeda, and that all they're doing really is arming the Sunni groups who still refuse to submit to Maliki's government, and training them just guarantees more bloodshed later and more fighting later on. This surge is a joke. This is a temporary thing. It's just another one of these 6-month turning point things that we're just supposed to hang on 6 more months and 6 more months and 6 more months forever. Anybody who in the press, who's actually a reporter, who's supposed to be covering this story, who's worried that they might be on the wrong side of it if they don't report that everything's hunky-dory, is a fool and shouldn't be reporting on this in the first place.
Well, the good news is the reporters who are actually in Iraq, when they're on TV and, in the major newspapers, I think they do a pretty good job of giving a clear picture, as they see it. The problem is, particularly on TV, they're simply not on. I mean, the reports are simply not aired. I mean, if MSNBC devoted 1.5% of its news hole to Iraq, so I think I trust the people on the ground. I've always trusted the reporters on the ground almost since day one. But the problem we're having now is their editors and producers back in New York and Washington simply won't put them on the air. I mean, they simply will not report Iraq as a substantial news story. Now, what's different is they love reporting about Iraq policy. They'll report the Beltway debate,
right.
The who's up, who's down. Do Democrats have? That's what they love. That's just old-fashioned horse race politics.
Right.
And they'll spend all the time they need. It's easy. It's simple. It doesn't cost any money. You can get the talking heads. It's all about politics.
Right.
That's separate. That the press has covered ad nauseum. I don't think it's been very nuanced or insightful, but they've spent a lot of time doing that because, as I said, it's easy. The war reporting is a completely different story, and that is where the press has really walked away from it.
Yeah, and, it's funny, I think of, like, a guy like Chris Matthews. He was an aide to Tip O'Neill, right?
Right,
I mean, that's where a lot of these guys come from, is they are the kind of rubber meets the road, electoral politics kind of people in the first place.
Right, that's what really gets them excited.
Yeah, and so, to them, that's everything, is Obama said this, and then Hillary said that back.
Right.
What do you make of it? We got 4 guests on this hour to talk about the back and forth between Hillary and Obama, and
right.
And you're right, that is, I don't know why that's easier. I'd have more trouble trying to keep track of that stuff.
But you just sit around and sort of jabber.
Right.
You certainly don't have to leave your studio, and you just it's simple and it's easy and it's inexpensive. Covering a war is a whole other story, and that's where the disconnect has come. And if you look at these surveys that I cite in my article, in terms of viewer interest, not nearly as interested in the Beltway debate about the war. It doesn't rank nearly as high. Americans have been consistent through the whole summer that they're interested specifically in the situation in Iraq. They don't really care about the wrangling in the Beltway. That's not a story that interests them. What's happening with the troops in Iraq is far away the most important story to news consumers, and it's a story that the press, particularly TV, all but boycotted all summer.
I like how in your article here you list some other topics that Nightline covered instead of the war: the popularity of organic pet food, the favorite songs of Pete Wentz, bassist for Fall Out Boy, the folding of supermarket tabloid The Weekly World News, oh man, the rise of urban McMansions, the death of the postcard, the commercial battle between Barbie and Bratz dolls, and the nerd stars of the movie Superbad. That was on Nightline?
7 weeks. Last 7 weeks, Nightline has aired. They do 3 segments now, so they've done over 100 segments since mid-July, and they haven't done a single report about the situation in Baghdad. But as you said, those are some of the stories they did do during that 7-week stretch.
Yeah. I'll tell you something. Somebody sent me a link the other day. I'm not sure if you saw this footage, but there was a protest up in Canada at some meeting of capitalists and bureaucrats or something, and the lefties were outside protesting. And there were 3 guys with the black masks and so forth, dressed up like they were anarchists, but it was obvious that they were cops, that they were middle-aged, weightlifting cops. They didn't look like skinny little anarchists at all, And so everybody called them out, and it was the cop who had the rock in his hand, and it was this big thing. Anyway, the point of the story is that somebody sent me a link to news coverage of this going on in Canada. And it was a national news network, I forget exactly, but it was a national news thing. And it was the top story of the show, apparently. And they spent 15, 17, 20 minutes saying, explaining, here's the footage, here's our reporter on the scene talking all about it, saying every single thing that there is to report about this case, having time to say every single thing he knows, questions and answers from the anchors back. And I thought, you know what? This reminds me of watching TV news in like 1982 or something. I can't believe, wow, look, mainstream media spending 15 minutes on an important news story and actually trying on TV and actually trying to get every bit of information that they can, even if it makes the government look bad. And that to me was the most impressive thing. Of course cops throw rocks and pretend to be anarchists. Who does anybody think starts all these riots? Of course it's them. Never mind that. The news story here is that there was a news story, a real honest to goodness news story about it.
Was this Canadian news?
Yeah,
that
Canadian
was probably the CBC, which is great.
Yeah, I just, I'm not sure. Yeah, it very well may have been. The CBC. But yeah, I was shocked, and it was like watching the news 20 years ago or something when I was a little kid.
They took a long time to do an important news story and weren't afraid of, being attacked for being liberal or whatever it is.
Right.
The press is just scared out of its wits and has been for, the last 6 years.
Yeah, see, that's the part I can't understand is what's to be scared of? So they're going to call you names,
No, it's profession. It's careerism. It's your job. It's your career path.
Mm-hmm.
That's what, unfortunately, too many of these journalists sort of hold near and dear to their hearts. And they've seen, they're very smart people, and they see the career trajectory, and they understand what the pitfalls are, and you just, that's why you write about John Edwards' haircut, and you sort of chuckle and laugh, and everyone sort of pats each other on the back because they're so savvy and sophisticated, and it's a boys' club, and you can make a very good living out of it. So that's what they're afraid of. That's the fear, not being called names or anything like that. It's how's it going to affect my career path?
Yeah, that's funny. I guess I've never really thought before of ranking media people, news anchors in there on the list, with magicians and stand-up comedians and TV actors and movie actors and whatever in the little rank of celebrity. I guess the TV news anchors fit in there somewhere between
you were mentioning
magicians and comics.
Yeah, you were mentioning Katie Couric. In the last year since Katie Couric has been on at CBS.
It's been a year? Oh, man.
Yeah, I think it was a year this week. Between the New York Times and the Washington Post, I guarantee they've written 50 articles.
Oh.
And she reads the news off the teleprompter for 22, not even 22. She's actually on camera about 8 minutes a night. It's the complete cult of personality. And it's a whole separate topic, but the press can become convinced that, TV anchors are important, influential people that should be covered as if they're world leaders and politicians. It's a joke.
Yeah, they're their own news stories.
Yeah.
I like that. And what's funny, too, is, when they really started the cable news channels, really first with CNN and then, of course, everybody racing to catch up, I thought, the promise there was that we were going to finally have, frontline-style documentaries and real investigative news reporting, because now they have all the time in the world. But
all the time in the world, right. Unfortunately, the cable producers view the world in 15-minute segments, and because that's how you're rated. So you're right. The idea was, 24 hours. Look at how we're going to possibly fill all this time. Well, we'll fill it with interesting, innovative news.
Right.
And as we've seen, it's all just sort of copycat stuff.
And sometimes there really is investigative reporting.
Yep.
But then
it just makes you wonder why.
Right.
Why is it only 3 times a year when they have to fill up about 800 hours a year or whatever it is?
Or sometimes, I'll be amazed to see how much work they'll put into telling the story of a murder that took place in some American city.
Yeah.
They will really investigate and do a substantial report about
this
guy killed his wife, and wanted some money or something. And, like Bill Curtis on Investigative Reports on A&E, he used to actually cover real stories. Now it's all just true crime nonsense.
Right.
Yeah.
As if people have never killed each other in passion before. I know it's treated as wildly important when, unfortunately, it's pretty common in America these days.
Yep. All right. Well, so what would you do about it? I don't know. I buy out Rupert Murdoch with my my newfound treasure chest, and I put you in charge of. I won't put you directly in charge of Fox News. That wouldn't be fair to the guys. But I put you in charge of, parts of the media empire, and you want to make some changes, some systemic changes, some structural changes that will guarantee that things are tilted more toward what's important. How do you do it? What do you want to? What changes would you make?
Well, I mean, it's a tough business because people make changes and then the ratings, dip 3% and everyone freaks out and runs back to the old formula. But the hope it would be that you wouldn't play copycat. Specifically, you don't chase Fox. You talked about libertarian and filling the marketplace. I mean, look at Keith Olbermann. I mean, his show is far and away the most successful cable news show in the last year. His audience has doubled.
Oh, really?
And Olbermann has mentioned a couple times he's been shocked that no one has come after his audience, which is essentially liberal or progressive and anti-war. I mean, he's obviously made that a cornerstone of his show.
Mm-hmm.
The show has doubled. Its ratings has doubled in the last year. No other show comes close, and not one show has tried to go after his market. And he's mentioned a couple times he's been shocked that no one has tried to, make a run at his territory. But for some reason, if you have a progressive agenda and your show doubles, all these producers who normally are so quick to copycat just sort of look at it and say, no thanks. We're not interested in those rating gains.
Huh.
Yeah, I mean, it's really unusual because the cable news business is absolutely known for its copycat approach. And here's Olbermann with the most successful show, and no one's interested in copying it.
Right, and it seems like if these executives want to keep their jobs, eventually denying their stockholders money they could be making is supposed to, have some backlash there. Maybe
Instead, CNN continues to carry, right-wing talk show hosts like Glenn Beck, whose ratings have been on decline all year. I mean, some nights, he gets like 50,000 viewers in his demo, and this is a country of 300 million.
Yeah.
He's absolute dead weight for CNN, but he's been on a year and a half, and there's no indication they're going to drop him, even though he's a ratings bust.
Huh.
So there seems to be a pretty clear double standard.
Yeah, sure sounds like it, and. I don't know. I guess if you want, we got a little bit more time. If you want to get into the presidential campaign a bit, I've noticed, and to be fair, I understand, you have to kind of be in the polls to be in the polls and to get covered. And once you get covered, then you get more ratings and so forth. But it seems like so early on in the primaries, Gravel and Kucinich on the Democratic side, and particularly Ron Paul and even Tom Tancredo and some of those guys, have been just so completely marginalized by the media that I think it was Howard Kurtz wrote a thing in the Washington Post after the first couple of debates saying we should get rid of all the dead weight now, and they almost uniformly refuse to cover the candidacies of these guys who, Gravel is a retired senator and a pretty successful one back in the day when he was a senator. Paul and Kucinich both, and members of the House of Representatives in good standing, running for president of the United States. And what do you have to do to get some coverage of these people?
Well, basically, it's a catch-20. I mean, it's a catch-22 or carrot or chicken or the egg, whatever your analogy. You got to make a run in the polls. I think you have to show the press that your ideas or your agenda has resonated with enough of voters to be taken seriously. So, for better or for not, when a field gets too enormous, it's understandable that the press is going to sort of use, a particular, bar. In this case, it's polling, and it always has been. And it would be nice, though, just to put it to the test, if we could see a candidate with one of those, with the same agenda as one of those candidates, really break through, and then we would see if the press, was comfortable covering candidates whose agenda was, not such, considered sort of a rubber stamp mainstream approach.
Yeah.
That would be an interesting test case because right now it's hard to argue, that the press isn't given enough to candidates who, are really quite low in the polls, and if they could move those ratings up, then I think they would have a better case in terms of complaining about the lack of coverage.
Right. Yeah, that really is fair, and I guess we'll see, right? It seems to me like a lot of these Republicans are on their way out, and though Paul is not doing all that well in the nationwide polls, he's continuing to rake in the funds, and he's definitely, obviously, he's going to be in the race through the primary season.
Yeah, of those candidates you mentioned, he seems to have struck, the biggest chord. I mean, obviously, it's not on the same scale as any of the major candidates, but his does seem to be the most interesting, and particularly online, he seems to have generated the biggest following and the most passion. So it'll be interesting how, his candidacy progresses.
Yeah, and it'll also be interesting to watch the dissonance on the faces of these news reporters when they do cover them, trying to figure out, I guess Stephen Colbert made the joke out of it, the enigma wrapped in the sesame seed bun of mystery and all that, because they don't know how to deal with somebody who's anti-war and pro-capitalism.
No, right.
So you have these people who sometimes they ask him, should he be running as a Democrat, and I don't know. I like that. I like watching their faces twist, and just revealing how little the news anchors really understand about the world compared to some of the people in their audiences,
Yeah, I think the press does prefer candidates to come in nicely wrapped packages, and it makes it easier for them to create a narrative and to sort of describe them in a sort of a shorthand style.
Uh-huh. And, even when they're just doing the banter about, the back and forth about the candidates and, a little bit of Iraq policy and this and that and there, I sometimes get the idea that a lot of these news people, the pundits on the cable news channels, but even the news anchors, I get the idea from their questions a lot of times that they get all their news from TV, too.
Oh,
that they don't read. So
I don't know. Well, I'm sure it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, I mean, if I got all my news from the radio, this would be the stupidest show in the world. I mean, what would be the point of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I just don't know. Good TV people have staffs and producers that read for them and will, help educate them.
Someday. Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah, that would be nice.
All right. Well, hey, I really appreciate your time today, everybody. Eric Boehlert from Media Matters for America. They're MediaMatters.org. Really appreciate your insight today, sir.
Sure thing. Talk to you soon.